Constable Pallet and I reached Rose Street and instinctively ducked as we entered the passageway, stepping between the drunks and vagrants crammed in like baby mice. The sunken road was flooded in a brown, muddy lake that seeped into my socks through the holes in my shoes. High on one wall, an artisan's symbol had been sculpted in metal, a man's arm holding a hammer, threatening to crush anyone who dared pass. I couldn't imagine why I'd been brought here. With a cramp in my stomach, I wondered if I was being called upon to identify the body of someone I knew, and immediately thought of Alfie and Jacob, and then, because my mind always turns to the blackest of outcomes, Constance. It couldn't be so. Why would any of them be here, in this street? And if they were, why would I be called upon first? They had families of their own. Pallet stopped at number 6, an unremarkable door, slightly ajar, next to a shuttered window. I could hear noises within, the hushed, insistent tones of people who were frightened and trying to decide what to do about it. He pushed open the door and went inside, but I hesitated on the step, my palms itching. "Mr. Stanhope," he called over my shoulder. "This way, sir." The narrow hallway was dark and crowded with people, mostly tradesmen and a few women, dressed simply and respectably. The wall was hung with advertisements for events and speakers, but I couldn't read their names in the half dark. We passed rooms on the left and the right, one filled with beds and another laid out for a meeting, the table piled with papers and pamphlets. At the end, a back door opened into a sheltered courtyard where oil lamps had been hung from wooden stairs, hissing and flickering. It wasn't raining, but everything was wet, as if the sun never found its way in between the buildings. A group of 5 or 6 men standing in a circle, and one of them with his right hand in his baggy suit pocket and the other scratching his unkempt beard, squinted in my direction. His face was ashen. Another fellow touched his elbow and attempted to comfort him, but he barely seemed to notice. I realized with a prickle of blood in my cheeks that I knew him, or I had known him a long time ago. I had no desire to meet him again. Of course, he possibly couldn't remember me. I was so changed. "Over here, Mr. Stanhope," said Pallet, and led me towards the centre of the courtyard. A tall fellow with a long nose came towards us, picking his way through the shallows like a fastidious heron. "I'm Detective Inspector Hooper," he said in an accent that one born in the slums might consider upper class, but to one familiar with the upper class, my father's small-town ministry reached all kinds, sounded merely affected. I glanced at Pallet, whose expression was blank. "Why am I here?" "A tragedy, a crime, and may I say, a curiosity." Hooper rubbed his hands together and grinned, showing me an expensively assembled row of teeth. "Come and see for yourself." I followed him towards the gaggle of men, who whispered as we approached. One of them, with heavy whiskers and a blunt, bullish face, was writing in a notebook. He nodded to me, but I took no notice. I was more concerned with what they had been looking at. It was a grave of a sort, but no more than 2 feet deep, dug roughly out of the earth and sodden. A woman was lying within, eyes closed, her hair fanning out on the surface of the water. Her lips were dark, and her skin was grey, bloated. At her chest, an inch below her breastbone, a fierce rip in her blouse was marked by a bloodstain blossoming like a red water lily. I recognized her at once as the woman who had come into the pharmacy, who had purchased bromide but had seemed more interested in me. Having spent 2 years as the secretary to a surgeon, I had seen hundreds of corpses, crushed, knifed, poisoned. beaten and drowned, but it was still shocking to see someone deaf who I'd met in life. Stabbed in the gut, stated Hooper in a matter-of-fact tone. Her name's Dora Harrigan. Did you know her? No. Why have you asked me to come? Of course, I didn't know her. Not really. Meeting someone once isn't knowing them, and I didn't want anything to do with this. I wanted to go home and eat Constance's attempted stew and sip a glass of Alfie's whiskey and read my book in my bedroom window. Even so, something chafed inside of me. My denial somehow made her seem more dead. Interesting. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. This was in her purse. He turned it around to show me, and I was amazed to read my name and address, written in a neat, flowing hand. Apparently this woman, Dora Hannigan, hadn't come in simply to buy an ounce of bromide or escape the storm. She had sought me out by name. And yet she hadn't given me any indication of it at the time. She hadn't introduced herself or asked who I was. Why had she walked through my door that day, so shortly before her death? No, before her murder. I told you, I don't know her. Hooper nodded. I had the impression he wanted me to think he believed me, though I was certain he didn't. Have you been here before? No, never. He sniffed and surveyed the courtyard, which was narrower than the buildings were tall, lending it an ecclesiastical air. These people call it a club, he said with a sneer. They're radicals and anarchists, planning to end all that's proper and industrious. Scoundrels, the lot of them. He didn't seem to care that the men sitting on the steps were well within earshot, hats in their hands and heads lowered, or that the women leaning on the balustrade above us were humming, Nearer, my God, to thee, her expression peaceful, even as her tears fell. There was no sign of Miss Hannigan's children. I wondered where they were, but I couldn't ask Cooper about them now, not after saying I didn't know their mother. I felt another pinch of guilt. It doesn't look as though anything was stolen, I said. She still has her necklace and shoes. Nothing was stolen as far as we know, Hooper admitted. If you don't mind me making an observation, Mr. He waved a hand, trying to remember my name. I didn't help him. You don't sound very shocked. Most people would be highly disturbed to see something like this. I realized why he brought me here in such secrecy. He thought Dora Hannigan and I had known each other, and that I had killed her, and on seeing my handiwork so exposed, would break down in tears and admit my guilt. He was disappointed by my sanguinity. I work in a hospital. Not much disturbs me anymore. Can I go now? I was regretting coming to this place with Pallet. I risked a glance towards the man I recognized from before, but he had his back to me, fidgeting and moving his weight from foot to foot, as if unable to keep still. I was still staring at him as he turned. I only just averted my eyes in time. Had I learned nothing? She was unmarried, Hooper continued, not answering my question. But she wasn't a prostitute, as far as we can tell. Why would you think she was? She's dead, isn't she? He scowled at the men on the steps, and one of them, with a bald head and hard eyes, scowled right back, unblinking. If it's not robbery, it's usually the other thing. Maybe she's someone's mistress. Crime of passion. Are you married? No. And crimes of passion are generally more... I struggled for the word, staring down at her in the meager lamplight. She looked as though she'd been set in amber. They're more savage. They're messy, and it shows on the deceased. This is too clean. Will you be sending the body to a surgeon? Hooper smoothed his moustache. What's the point? The cause of death is obvious. Perhaps. Is there blood on her back as well? The detective nodded at Pallet. who sighed deeply and crouched down beside the hole, collapsing its edges and submerging his boots in the mud. He took her arm and pulled her on her side so her face lolled under the water. I had the urge to beg him to let her fall back so she could breathe. But of course that was foolishness. Her dress was torn on the right of her spine. Whatever had been used to stab her was long and sharp, going all the way through. A sword, perhaps, said Hooper. He made a thrusting motion with an imaginary weapon. Do you own the sword? No, of course not. Is there another way into the courtyard other than the way that we came? Pallet pointed towards the darkest corner. There's a back gate. Why do you want to know? Asked Hooper, with a note of irritation. She may have been killed somewhere else and brought here. He rolled his eyes. I doubt that. Someone in the midden is the killer, stands to reason. I fetched one of the lamps and squatted beside her, studying the tiny lines around her eyes, the long-healed scar on her jawline. I couldn't understand how anyone could take another person's life in this way. Still, I told myself I had examined hundreds of corpses before, and always with the same aim, to find out how they had died. It was all I could do for her now. Her clothes were all in place, so she was spared that at least. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, memories pulling me in. The courtyard spun and slowly settled. There are no signs of a struggle, I said. Hooper pursed his lips, embarrassed to be hanging on the words of a man he brought here as a suspect. She couldn't fend him off, could she? She's just a woman. It's unusual, though, in my experience. I took her hand, pulling up her sleeve and turning her palm upwards. Accustomed to cadavers as I was, it still felt strangely intimate. No cuts, wounds or bruises from a fight. If someone attacked me with a sword, I'd try to deflect the blade. Wouldn't you? Maybe she was taken by surprise. He clapped his hands together. Or maybe she was stabbed in the back. That would explain it. By surprise, yes, perhaps, but not in the back. Look here. The wound on her front is wider than the one on her back, so the blade was tapered, a dagger or a short sword. Beneath her hair, her neck was purple and mottled. I pressed my 2 fingers against her skin, and the mottling didn't change. Rigor mortis has set in, and her blood has already congealed. She's been dead for 12 hours at least, I would say. Hooper shook his head with a condescending smirk. You're wrong. She's not stiff yet, so it happened sometime today. Like I said, must have been someone local. I was growing impatient. In my experience, the police could see about as far as their fists could reach, and no further. She's lying in cold, wet ground, and that can delay rigor mortis significantly. This happened more than 12 hours ago, but probably less than 36. Pallet wiped his hands down his jacket. And where were you during those hours, Mr. Stanhope? Aside from being asleep, I was working at St. Thomas's Hospital and drinking whiskey with my landlord until late. He can vouch for me. Hooper pulled a tortoiseshell pen out of his pocket and wrote that down, slowly and carefully. A drizzle had started, and he had to hunch over his notebook to keep the paper from being soaked. Right then, you can go now, Mr. Stanhope. We'll let you know if we have any more questions for you. He turned abruptly towards Pallet, thumbing in the direction of the group of men. We'll have to chat with these lot, especially that shifty fellow. What was his name? Duport, sir, said Pallet. John Duport. Yes, him. Let's see if he has the sword or something similar. I was covered in mud and starting to shiver. I bent down to push Dora Hannigan's hair from her forehead and noticed something glinting at her neck, a silver locket. I opened it up. The pictures inside had survived the water. They weren't well drawn, and I wouldn't have known who they depicted if I hadn't seen the living subjects a few days before. The dour boy and the inquisitive girl, one either side, facing each other across the hinge. "Detective!" I called after Hooper. He looked back at me, frowning, appearing surprised that I was still there. "It's Detective Inspector." I held up the locket. She had a son and daughter. Where are they now? "She was unmarried, like I said." I ignored his idiocy. "You should ask the people here if anyone has them." He raised his eyebrows and cast around as if they might be behind a water barrel. "I suppose so. See to it, Pallet." He stood under one of the lamps, reading his notes. He hadn't thanked me. A man approached and put out his hand to pull me upright, which I ignored. He was that large, whisked fellow I'd seen earlier. "J.T. Whitford," he announced. "The Daily Chronicle, and you are—" "Cold," I replied. "I'm wet and keen to get home." I rarely read a newspaper, but even if I did, it wouldn't be the Daily Chronicle, a salacious rag filled with gossip about actors' latest dalliances and hysterical warnings about rabies epidemics. I had no idea why anyone would read such claptrap. Whitford pulled out a notebook and pencil. Today, everyone seemed to write down what I had to say. "When did you first meet Miss Hannigan?" He had a blunt accent that I thought might come from Yorkshire. My sister, who could place a voice to any country south of Hadrian's Wall, would have told me for sure, down to the nearest town probably. "Never. Are you a member here or just a radical sympathiser?" "What?" He rolled his eyes. "Look, these coppers spill the old story for fourpence. A cigarette, most of them. You might as well tell me what you're doing here." "I'm sorry, I can't help you." I pushed past him, intending to leave, but then stopped. The man I had recognised, with the ragged beard and the unlaundered suit, was staring at me. He glanced quickly at Hooper, who was still flicking through his pages, and beckoned me to follow him, away from the others, beneath the gallery, where ice over from January's blizzard was still clinging to the ground. I ignored him, but he waved more insistently, and I feared he would call out my name if I didn't respond. It was a risk I couldn't take. He was huddled against the wall, so deep in the shallows I could hardly see him. He grabbed my sleeve and pulled me closer, almost hissing into my ear. "Why are you here? Tell me, be quick." Despite his urgency, his voice was well-mannered and clipped, every consonant perfectly pronounced. "I will not," I said, trying to pull away from him without anyone noticing. "Dora must have kept your name and address, isn't it? That's it." He stepped into the lamplight, his eyes shining orange. "But this could be good news. You can help us. You'll do it, won't you?" "I don't even know who you are." "Of course you do. We met in Enfield, goodness. It must be 10 years ago. More even. Our mothers tried to, well, it seems pretty foolish now, wouldn't you say? My word, and to think what might have happened. I don't know you." "Yes, you do. He dropped his voice to a whisper. "I'm John Thackeray, and you're Lottie Pritchard. Or you used to be. And I'm certain you remember me full well." I could feel myself shaking and clasped my hands together, pinching the skin fiercely between my thumb and forefinger. I wished I had refused to come to this place. And I wished I had acknowledged having met Dora Hannigan. And I wished most of all that I had not come face to face with this man. What are you talking about? I need an alibi for yesterday, he said. And unless you want your secret exposed right now to these policemen, you're going to provide one.